everybody. Hi. Welcome to this evening's festivities, a gathering created by two great organizations, Art at a Time Like This and Jamaica Art Society. And we're so happy to have this turnout, as we say, for content, not commodity, on a week of art fairs, and with great artists and great ideas. Art at a Time Like sorry, provides platforms for artists to address social issues and current events in the most public way. And we always accompany our online exhibitions with dialogue and our big public art projects also with panel discussions and community involvement. And we feel really, really honored to be working with Tiana Webb Evans tonight. And the key to everything we do is collaboration, and we have a knack of collaborating with great people, usually great women. So thank you all very much for coming, and I introduce you to Tiana Webb Evans.
Thank you, Barbara. Needless to say, collaboration is always the name of the game. And Anne and Barbara, I just said to them, if I was going to go to war with anyone, it would be them. They have been incredible partners and passionate early supporters of Jamaica Art Society. Art at a Time Like This and Jamaica Art Society are both pandemic babies, founded around the same time, and we were all introduced through Seth Rodney. And from that moment, we have been together, and we haven't left each other. They hosted our first online exhibition. These exhibitions are the culminating part of our 9-month fellowship program. So Jamaica Art Society's In Focus Fellowship Program is focused on professional development for emergent and mid-career artists, curators, and writers in Jamaica and of Jamaican descent. We have been very proud to host some of the most exciting new talents or established talents to date. This is our second cohort, hailing everywhere from London, Toronto, Newark, Brooklyn, on and on, and Kingston, of course. Two of our fellows could not make it. One person's in Brazil and the other person had a conflict. With that being said, we are excited to present Rupture, Interventions of Possibility, co-curated by Gervais Marsh and Patrina Dakers, and featuring these wonderful artists. So if you haven't seen it, please go to artatatimelikelithis.com, and the exhibition is there for viewing. Quick introductions, formalities, of course. My phone would work. I'll start with Patrina. Patrina Dakers is an educator and curator of contemporary Caribbean and African diasporic art and visual culture. She's the head of the art history department at the Edna Manley College of Visual and Performing Arts in Kingston, Jamaica. Dr. Dakers is also a founding member of the Tide Rising Art Projects and has curated exhibitions internationally. I should wave. I'm not going in order. Timothy Yannick Hunter is a multidisciplinary artist and curator based in Toronto. His practice employs strategies of bricolage to examine non-neutral relationships relating to Black and Afro-diasporic experiences. A University of Toronto graduate, he has been an artist in residence at the Art Gallery of Ontario and Pada Studios in Barreiro, Portugal. Timothy, welcome. All right, hold on, I'm skipping around here. Zachary Fabry. Zachary, hometown hero, as I like to call him, is a Jamaican-Hungarian interdisciplinary artist engaged in lens-based media language systems and public space. Based in Brooklyn, he is a recipient of the Louis Comfort Tiffany Foundation Award and other prizes, including the Rome Art Prize recently. He has presented his work at the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Barnes Foundation, and many other venues. Zinzi me not. is a dancer, filmmaker, and artist, and she seeks to complicate the boundaries of dance, singing, or performances, filmic explorations, and objects as different but connected to manifestations of dance and body-based outcomes. She's specifically interested in telling Caribbean stories and highlighting the histories of those enslaved and the Windrush generation. Welcome to New York, Zinzi. Shoshana Weinberger. I just would like to shout out the crew from across the Hudson who are in the house today. Thank you, New Jersey, for showing up. Earned her MFA from Yale University and her BFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She's based in Newark, New Jersey, and her work references her Caribbean American background, exploring the complexity of heritage. Her work is also held in numerous public collections in the United States and abroad. She is from Kingston. And Gervais Marsh, another person I need to give a shout out to, because while he was curating this exhibition with Patrina, he was also defending his dissertation. So Dr. Marsh, congratulations. He's a writer, scholar, and curator whose work is deeply invested in Black life, concepts of relationality, and care. They're a PhD in performance studies at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, and an editor of the Ruckus Journal. They have published and curated widely and grew up in Kingston. And then, last but definitely not least, our fabulous moderator, Ashley James, Associate Curator at the Guggenheim Museum, and Ayati. So thank you all for being here. We're excited about this dynamic conversation, and we appreciate you all for showing up. Oh, hello. I appreciate you all for showing up on one of the busiest nights of New York Art Week. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Tiana. Thank you all for being here. I have to give my shout out to Tiana because you're great at bringing people along and into the fold. And you contacted me about the Jamaica Art Society, and I told you this at a time where I was kind of grappling with my own identity vis-a-vis Jamaica as somebody who has parentage. Both my parents were born in Jamaica, emigrated in the 70s and 80s, but I spent my entire life here. And all of my schooling, all of my knowledge around Black art was really and has been really rooted in American context. And I thank you for showing me that there is this kind of expanded context, specifically as it relates to the Caribbean, that is a call to action and is a must. And so I'm really privileged to be in your orbit and to be here and to be in conversation with these amazing artists and curators, which will take me to my first question. It's very rare for me to be moderating a group where I'm moderating like who would be the moderators, because you guys could easily do this. But it's great because it offers just additional layers. And I'm wondering if we can begin with the two of you, Doctors Gervais and Patrina, where you can just tell us about Rupture as a concept. You have been in conversation with these artists and two others that weren't able to make it, and you came to this concept of the rupture that is so rich in meaning. And if you could just give a kind of intro for this audience around why that framework was useful in thinking through the practices of these artists. So, yeah.
I think so. I've heard it.
Okay. I'm thinking about the initial conversations that we had and how because we were trying to hold a lot of the complexities that are part of Jamaica, are part of the Caribbean, and thinking about friction. You know, a lot of my own work thinks about frictions and like what emerges within spaces of friction, and not kind of in a binary of negative or positive, but thinking about holding multiple realities. And we also were very cognizant that this is an exhibition with Jamaican artists. We're born and raised in Jamaica, or part of the larger Jamaican diaspora, and we didn't want it to be pigeonholed in the way that so often writing about the Caribbean, right, particularly Jamaica, like, there's like this, everyone associates, like everyone erases the complexities of the Caribbean by associating it only with Jamaica, which we were talking about earlier today. Right. But also, Jamaica is almost, there's this particular kind of stagnant imaginary of what Jamaica is. And so we were very conscious of how do we intentionally think about the work that each of the artists are doing, which is connected to Jamaica, is connected to the Caribbean, it's connected to their own relationships to those spaces, but also is not reproducing the pigeonholing that happens. And also like thinking about Rupture as a space of grappling with the violences that created the modern Caribbean, but also thinking about what emerges from rupture and ruptures. And so it's also like it's also thinking about different scales, so personal, local, national, international, and what does it mean to hold those violences, to reckon with those violences, to name those as realities that are continuing, whether we would like to name them as explicitly or not, but also to think about what emerges from those spaces.
We're good? Well, you have to say something. Hello. I think also the term itself has a sort of hopefulness. We talked about this as well. There's an urgency in the work that these artists are doing, but also, and a lot of the work is about a certain kind of violence, whether it's, as Gervais says, political or very personal. But there's something hopeful about the work that they're doing in attempting to remake our world, and I think that word really captures the type of work that they're doing. And also, we were, thinking of Timothy has a work in the exhibition called Pele's Tower, right? And that's a work that tries to think about Martinique before and after the volcanic eruption of 1902. And I think we like this idea of this sort of art sort of speculating about what could be possible in this world. And so it's just the phrase rupture really captures, and it's not just rupture, right? It's rupture and possibilities. What did we say? What was the last
Interventions.
Interventions of possibilities. And so we kind of like that idea too, of like what does it mean for art to intervene? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also like, I don't know, I think there's always this like projection, particularly onto artists who are Black, to be siloed into discussions of resistance, even interventions. I don't think interventions necessarily equals resistance, And so it's all, I feel like so often, so it's like double siloing of Jamaica, Caribbean, Black, to make work that is explicitly political in a very narrow kind of way. And I think so much of our conversations was thinking about what is a psychic work that each of the artists are trying to explore. Like, how are they thinking about rupture as also on a personal, on an intimate, on a bodily, on a mental level, and also how we all hold those kind of ruptures and what comes out of that. And I don't think it's necessarily, something good is going to come out of it. We don't know, but it's like that's the realities that we're navigating, And so I think that was also important for us, was to not position to not think of rupture as like, Jamaica struggle, intervention, but it's also violence. Like, it's all of these, like, it's about these complexities that I think we can hold. I think each of the artists hold those complexities in their work, and I think we wanted to hold that and not reproduce that kind of siloing that so often happens.
That's a good segue into kind of opening it up to the artists to speak about their practice, because as you both just arrived upon in your discussion of the complexity of rupture, what I love about the term is what you have already said, which is that it has this kind of duality embedded within it, where the rupture is critique, but inherent within it is this kind of futurity. There's something that happens after the rupture no matter what. And I'm wondering if you can speak to this duality around that kind of balance between how much of the practice is critiquing all of the bad, whether that's colonialism, imperialism, slavery, afterlife slavery, all of these things, violence of various kinds, versus shaping some kind of future that lives outside of that or beyond it or in tandem. How much do you see your work as kind of responding versus a moving through or beyond outside of those paradigms? And I'm wondering if perhaps you can give an example as a way of foregrounding it for the audience. So Zinzi, could you start? I'm looking at you.
I was like really trying to break eye contact, but you had me, I was saying. Yeah, I think maybe like the central thing that I like keep coming back to in my work is like a triptych around repetition, duration, and exhaustion. And I really rely on them both as a dancer because dance training is repetitive, and there's this idea of like, again, do the play again. Like, what can you learn in the repetition of the same boundary? Like, how do you learn yourself more? And I think also, like, the politics, like, I'm like raised in the UK. There is this like real need to keep repeating what happened. Like, the memory is so short. So I think like, it's like there's all, like maybe to like borrow the phrase rupture, there's always like a new rupture. Like, it's like you have to keep reminding, and it's like a corrosive experience. And I think a lot of my practice, like, I've been making the same film for 6 years, and I release it on the same day every year, and I've committed to making it for the rest of my life or until we get reparations, right? Like, that's kind of what I'm doing. And every year, it's like I'm the first person to have a conversation about this topic, and it's like trying to cut the space again to say, we need to talk about this. It's like it heals over. So I think that's the example. Did I ask you a question?
So definitely both, it seems to me. I mean, if in terms of the duality of this critique versus the kind of progression, it seems like they inform one another, or it's a loop that, I don't know if there's some kind of final rupture that is what breaks you out of it, but how you kind of see the work as a liberatory kind kind
How do I see the work as a liberatory project?
I mean, you don't have to
Okay.
answer that question. That was just a kind of another way of framing.
I think that maybe I'm in like a kind of head down mode, you know, like I feel like my practice isn't necessarily trying to imagine a new future. I'm just trying to get there, right? Like, that's really where I'm at. Like, again, okay, all right. Again, like, I'm kind of like this, whereas I feel like I'm hoping when I look up, what I imagined is gonna be there is there. But I'm not necessarily dreaming that. I'm just trying to, like, as my mom would say, cut and go through. You know, that's the way I think my mind is at.
You. Mm-hmm. Timothy, do you want to jump in here? Also, another artist who uses repetition as critical to, I think in a different way, but as both kind of an aesthetic, but also as meditation on memory and transmission. And yeah, if you could talk a little bit about Rupture as critique versus Rupture as the after the break.
I don't know. Oh, I'm on. Okay. Yeah, I think, so for context, a lot of the work I make uses maybe archival footage, found image. And so I think a lot about maybe, when we got when you guys fielded that, the concept to us, Rupture really, for me, made a lot of sense. thinking about fragments and fragmented history, and so for those who don't know, I'm based in Canada, so our Black history is the lens which we view it, because U.S. is neighbors, it's very can be very American centric, but at the same time there's a very unique, especially in Toronto, Black culture that's made up of all of us from the continent, the Caribbean, all over the place, right? And so I guess for me, it's like the work is, if we're talking about how to, whether it's like liberatory or resistance, like the one thing for me is like taking all of these parts, things that seemingly feel unlike, and then bring them together, not in a way to like make it like a whole or anything, but to present the fragments as fragments and not try to hide it or show it as anything else, like maybe a dumbed down version of what Blackness would be, and then I don't know. And then one thing I tend to focus on also is like the historical like research aspect of it. So for me, it's combing through the material. Is like, so it'd be, it's like video, it could be text, it could be image, but the whole idea is that it's kind of personal research, really. I'm fortunate enough to be an artist, and then so the output is like, these pieces or the installation or video or something like that. But I think the kind of the motivation or the impetus is like this thing to kind of try to understand history. And so for me, it's like I'm also, I'm born in Canada, so my parents are from Jamaica, and so it's very important for me to kind of approach it that way, as like, it's like I'm Jamaican, yes, but I'm also born here, and so I'm only, for instance, my grandmother left this book, we were helping her clean out like her stuff, and I have this book, Politics versus Economics. It's like the '89 election in Jamaica, and we're talking about like Siega and Manly and like the conflict and the history there, and then I grew up with my dad and my uncles like arguing over those things, like, like. And I guess it's like those little threads, those like personal threads kind of show up in the work, where you're kind of going back and trying to like seek. And so, I have this book, it's in the studio, and I'm always revisiting it, like scanning it and like repurposing images and text from it. And so, I think it's like, this longing to know or be somewhere that you weren't, or not longing to be there, but just kind of pulling all of it together and trying to like, make sense of it. So, Rupture is like, I'm thinking about fragments as like the post-rupture and like what to do with the fragments, I guess, yeah.
That's great. And it seems particularly suited to just a historical analysis and making sense of generations and a diasporic identity, Rupture as bringing together these fragmentations as you speak to. And I wonder if we can hold the kind of historical level of Rupture in our sites. If we can also think about the real individual and bodily, which seems to not be a posit, but to live on a spectrum with history as well. So Shoshana and Zachary, I'm wondering if you could talk about the body and Rupture, and why for you, not only the body, but your own bodies have been central to your practices, and very much invested in these questions of critique and possibility that Rupture present.
I think that, when I leave the house, I think about my body. And I think that most people do. Kind of coming to America, having to deal with that duality and the idea of white aesthetic and whiteness in America, and then how that's also translated in Jamaica, about how there's also these levels of like colorism within Jamaica and in America. And I think that that's been sort of a rupture in how how I saw myself. I mean, nobody in any of the magazines looked like me, and so sort of. But my mom, was beautiful, a beautiful Afro-Caribbean woman that was everything. But I continued to try and emulate and live up to those fashion magazines, and so there was this idea of a sense of visual violence, of not looking like anyone. And in my practice, I feel more like a visual anthropologist, sort of dissecting those criticisms, hair, lips, legs, anything that is sort of subjective, and thinking about that in a way to kind of come to terms with the duality, owning it, and thinking about how my body moves in these spaces, in and out of these spaces, as a marginalized body, I think, in terms of that. So similar to sort of the fragmentations that Timothy was talking about, I think that I've compartmentalized and reclaimed those spaces, and that's through the body. So.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you said.
I do want to ask the quick follow-up to actually both of you. Because why, I mean, this is, I'm endlessly kind of interested in, there are multiple mediums in which you all draw, actually. And this question of kind of like the personal, it can be found in anything from the book that was passed down to you from your grandmother to, in this case, yourself. And I wonder if, going back to this question of kind of like Caribbeanness and what you're saying about the archetype of whiteness in the US versus what you knew in the Caribbean, kind of like, do you see yourself as a kind of paradigmatic figure on which to ask these questions? Or is it more about just your body as the artist? I don't know if that's a kind of esoteric question, but it is about kind of like Caribbeanness and the multiple identities that you all hold, and that by nature leads to certain questions. This is for the curators as well. The hybridity that is inherent to the discourse of Caribbean thought. So do you see your body as expressing that kind of complexity as a Caribbean subject? I'm just curious to get a sense of that. Just a really good subject to think through questions of race, sexuality, nation, all of these things that artists of the Black diaspora in general and beyond the Black diaspora think through, but thinking about Caribbeanness as a specific identity category in which many of these questions come together. And I'm just wondering if as Caribbean people, you see yourself as a kind of critical subject to think through those things. Yeah, sure.
I think as a dancer specifically who went to a conservatoire in the UK as like one of 4 Black people in London, like my body, and also being in England, my body feels very Caribbean. Like my body feels very Black. I have done ballet since I was 3, and when I say I'm a dancer, the thing that I met with most, and this is not a joke, is, am I a stripper? Which, just to clarify, I'm very pro-sex work, like I don't mind, but I'm not. And am I a hip-hop dancer? And mostly that is to do with the configuration of my body and the color of my skin. And so I think like starting my artistic life through a bodily training, where I've had to learn to decide, like training in dance, you are not trained to think about your body as a choice. Your body is presumed. You will be present. You will perform. You will be watched. So learning to make choices about my body and my practice was very much a learned thing. and mostly due to hanging out initially with like people in live art and then moving my practice into visual art. And in that way, like my body feels like a rupture. Like I'm often the only black person in a ballet studio. And when I was training, I used to dance like I was like I don't know if you remember Streets of Rage, like I don't know how, right? Like I used to dance like warfare. And like now I don't. I made certain decisions about my dance practice, but a lot of that was proof, like to prove why I am the only black person on the stage, to prove why, or to meet the shock of my body on stage. And I think over the years, making decisions about trying to live in this body and not let how I experience living in this body be constantly defined by the whiteness that is looking at it, which I think is a life practice of having like a black body, a queer body, a poor body, whatever, but like having a physical practice. I had to get very real with that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to sustain a practice. And I think that is very inherent to how black bodies were viewed and carved up through the slave trade, right? Like, and having that body, having those hips, having like that bum, those breasts that like are quintessentially attached to that time, I think is like walking with a legacy all of its own. Yeah.
Absolutely. What resonates from all of that is your own body as Rupture, which I think is certainly something that the two of you, Patrina and Gervais, had in mind in terms of the full spectrum of what this Rupture could hold. Did you want to say something, Gervais?
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate everything that Zinzi just said, and it, resonates. And also I think there's this like equation that often happens with the Caribbean as a space of hybridity, and which I understand, and I like, but I have mixed, and Patricia and I talked about it, like I have mixed feelings about this hybridity, because I think what happens, and like in a Jamaican context, to just be more specific, with hybridity comes this erasure of blackness, and like the way hybridity is talked about is rooted in anti-blackness, because it's not about like, it's not just about, it is about, and also, that's become my new, I feel like everything, like I feel like each year it's harder for me to say any definitive things. I don't know. I'm like, it's this, all these things, yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think the hybridity thing, yes, about naming, and Patrina was really important, and I'm really happy that she did, like naming the various kinds of forced kidnapping, or like kidnapping is always forced, kidnapping, but also migrations, which are, even naming them as migrations, like of South Asian folks, like East Asian folks, it's still complex, because it's like, yeah, people are migrating, but it's because there's lack of resource. You know what I mean? Like all of these things are complex. But making sure that we named all of those things in the curatorial statement was important. And I think in that context, there's hybridity, thinking about Shoshana's work and holding those complexities of how people come together, of how people's cultures negotiate space, because that's what it is. It's not like they're just melding or blending and these kinds of words, which are like really aspirational, which I don't think anything's wrong with aspiration, but like holding the complexities of that, like they're negotiating space. And I think in Jamaica, which is a predominantly black country, and we had this conversation yesterday, like, anti-blackness is rampant in Jamaica, and it's like, and there's spaces you can go in Jamaica where it's not, you won't see black people, or you might see one black person or two, which is just like, for me, it's always mind blowing. I'm like, like in this country, how can you have this thing? But I think it's like holding this question of hybridity and like what comes from that, but also not just like hybridity equals we become better, or something new is formed and that new thing is inherently better, but just like there's multiplicity in that. And I think the Outer Many One People, which is the motto of Jamaica, is rooted in this kind of erasure. This is like, this like of, all these people are here, it's a melting pot. Well, it's like, well, actually it is, and also it's a predominantly black country. And you can hold both of those things, and one doesn't necessarily erase the other one. But what does end up happening is that in trying to move towards discussion of hybridity, we're stepping over some of the fundamental issues of Black working class people in Jamaica, Black dark skinned people in Jamaica, constantly being erased, even though people are the majority, Black people are the majority, you know.
Actually, if I can go back to Zachary, to talk about the body in your own practice. So if you could do that for us.
I was going to force the point as well, so thank you.
Yes, yes. But so I like that you brought up like working class and use the word erasure, and so those, I think, and then I think you chose these drawings that I made when I was in Brazil, and so the word erasure for me, it sounds like it's in the process of drawing. And I felt like I sometimes anecdotally say that, like, I'm always trying to make a drawing, and different kind of ways, but also trying to figure out what that mark is, or what process of making a mark is. And so there's something about the erasure of that working class, just using your example, but then in my work, it's more of like a staining or a rubbing. And so the work in particular is like I took this particular mineral, which is the dirt that is the earth in this particular region in Brazil, and just rubbed it on my body, like charge it, or and so I rubbed my body on the paper. And that's in the lineage of many artists doing similar things, right? But in this particular context, I was thinking about my mom and my aunt and laborers in a house in a domestic context, and how I witnessed that and have firsthand experience of that, but then see the effects of that on my mom and my aunt, like as my mom had like arthritis and like that kind of labor and what happens to the body over time. And so just to kind of wrap up, thinking about labor and then mark making and erasure as a kind of a temporal conversation.
Did you have any additional thoughts, Rashawn? I see you nodding.
Well, yeah. I think the idea of bodies being surveilled is something that I touched on in terms of like going out of the house and then thinking about coming home. The idea of being like captured but caricatures, like for me, and my late mother was also very, so everything's a caricature about Jamaica, and it's more complex than that. And so this idea of how one navigates being surveilled and how one navigates otherness is something that my mom sort of showed me how to like combat, but then there was also this way of like being part of the establishment by being able to move within and out. Somebody who doesn't at first have that appearance, oh, you don't look Jamaican. And I'm like, well, what is a Jamaican supposed to look like? So having to explain, which is exhausting and tiring, and thinking about the idea of how a country or a society or imperialism plays into this idea of ownership and roles and how we're supposed to act and be. Is part of that is the dissections that I do in the work. So, and I think there's this when I looked at the website, looked at the exhibition, it was just I could see this sort of flow between all of our works in that way, which trying to dismantle that, and so.
Wow. Oh, That's a lovely endorsement for checking out the exhibition online. But also, I had one final question for Timothy, because I'd be remiss without. I'm always good for an archive question, and we talked about the body and history, and I do wonder, kind of going back to the question of rupture. There has been kind of recent work. I think of somebody like Saidia Hartman as probably the most known example of people who are kind of invested in engaging with the archive and reconstituting it anew, finding kinds of modes of, it's not even so grand as to call it empowerment or liberation, but even just kind of an opening. And I'm curious, Timothy, as someone who is not using your own body, but is often drawing upon whether they be the images or otherwise of historical figures and the unknown, kind of how you see rupture as it relates to the archive. Can you disrupt the archive? What's happening with the intersection between your practice and what we would think of as the kind of stagnation of the archive?
I think there's a lot of kind of vantage points for that kind of thinking through the archive. Like what are we, like artists like myself who are working with found image and footage like this, or found object? It's like what are we trying to do? I think on one level there's like this, I don't know, I guess the feeling of, I feel like in a lot of cases like a reclaiming. So for example, I've done a residency, and when I was doing my residency at the Art Gallery of Ontario, it's like the Montgomery collection is like thousands of photos from the Caribbean. It's like colonial photos, like maybe 4,000 plus, something like that. You're kind of going through all these images, and you're seeing people, it's very domestic photographs or travel photography, these things. And I guess it's like you have this moment of wanting to like reclaim that, like you see folks in the image and you're just like, oh, like this is somebody, this could be me, that could be like, that's me right there. Like this is like that's a whole other conversation where you just like see yourself. We're talking about the body, and like I don't use my own body really in my work that way, but you see your body in everybody you're kind of like pulling from, or all the images you're pulling from. But I digress. It's like you have like all of these photos, and I guess it's like this, in a weird way, you're trying to reclaim them, and then also thinking about a bigger umbrella of like usage rights and like capitalism and who owns an image and these things. There's a part of it that's kind of like you're actually you want to kind of, you'll call it steal, but you pull it. And my influence really is from musicians and like black electronic musicians, whatever genre you want. If you want to talk dub, hip hop, if you want to talk whatever, it's the idea is like taking something and making something new out of it and like reclaiming it. And so there's moments where, I don't know, I think that's kind of the motivation, I guess, behind engaging with the archive like that. So it's like reclaiming, reappropriation is a word we like to use, I guess, sometimes. But also, I don't know, it's also, also to demonstrate, like, just because we have all of this information that lives in the world doesn't mean we know even anything about the actual history. That's why when oftentimes if you were to, we don't see the work up here, but it's like say it's a 4-minute video, it's really a non-linear narrative. I can't really reorganize it in a way that would make sense, because history in a lot of ways doesn't make sense, I guess,
Yes, I was going to say, Patrina.
Well, I just wanted to add to this, the archival question, by bringing in Onika Russell and Katrina Coombs, these are artists in the show who are not here, to think about the work that they're doing, the archival aspects of their work. So Katrina Coombs, her work is, she does performances as well as these sort of textile-based installation. And a lot of her work is really about her own experience, but also other women's experience during childbirth, and the loss that can occur during pregnancies and the birthing process. And in Jamaica's history making in Jamaica is very masculinist in a certain way, and I think of her work her work is about constructing an archive of a women's experience. I mean, this is one particular experience that women have, and I think of her work as archival in a certain way. She interviews women, she brings in their stories into her work. And of course, Onika Russell's work, she has this performance that she does with individuals where, so she uses these cards. Wow, look at that. So she uses these cards, and she has these one-on-one sessions with people, with an audience. And the cards are a way to sort of activate people's memories and ideas about their own experience. It's called the Personal Storytelling Workshop. And that work is also archival in a certain way about, sort of helping people to build their own kind of personal or engage their own kind of personal experience. And I think that's partly how their work connects to some of the work that everybody here are doing.
Can I say something about that? Yes, let me ask. Okay, you're gonna close us out.
Okay. I just was like, Timothy mentioned something about alluded to this idea of theft, and I steal a lot of footage quite intentionally. In the UK, very specific people own a very small amount of footage about Caribbean people. Pathé is probably the main one. And I use it a lot in my work, and I leave their logo in there, partly because I think it'd be interesting to be sued, and I think it would be a great performance. So I'm kind of seeing what will happen intentionally. But I also think it's important for people who have a relationship to the archive of oppression and enslavement specifically to question what stealing is. I'm not, I really can't, I need to be, these are my people. This is my family arriving, or my mum's friend's friend, and now I mustn't have it because who owns it? And that ownership is always whiteness. It's always the institution. In the UK, it's nearly always the royal family. And I cannot ask them for permission. So I won't. Even if at first it was because I didn't have the budget when I first started making the film, but now the film's 6 years old, there is budget, and I still will not pay for it. And I think there is this kind of, this is not original to me. I think artists are saying no. And I think it is important.
I love that Rupture is a no in some cases. Amazing. So I think that, yes, maybe time for one audience question.
Hello. And so you're all gathered under this sort of connecting idea of Jamaica as a place, as an origin of some sort. I think a lot about origin and origin story and how that kind of affects identity. So I'm curious about individually or collectively how important it is to be able to name the place Jamaica as some kind of site of origin, or how much you question that as an origin that inherently affects your identity or the way you move throughout the world.
Well, it used to be very important to me because I immigrated to the US, and in 1986, I was about 11 or 10, and I didn't feel like I belonged here. I really didn't, and that my experience here growing up marred the way I sort of operated in the world, and I needed to be back in Jamaica. I needed to go back. And having gone back and contribute, now I can leave and I can not feel this need to say, I am Jamaican. But that, and I think this is, my experience is very similar to people who've immigrated, right? This feeling of unbelongingness and wanting to belong somewhere. But I think for all of us also, and we've talked about it in different ways, there is also just tension saying that you belong to Jamaica, because Jamaica is a very difficult place to belong to. It's such a beautiful place, and I've had such a great experience going back to Jamaica, and just naturally it's really beautiful. I've had very great connection to people there, but it is also an extremely difficult place, right? And I think for me that's okay, because I've made my peace in the world. I've made my peace with living in the U.S. I've also made my peace with being in Jamaica, and that's part of the tension of being in the world, to have these multiple feelings, right? Yeah, and that's for me that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. That's like, I mean, that's a lot to hold, that question, I think. Because I mean, I grew up in Jamaica, but also I was born in Barbados. I don't have like familial connection, and I was saying this today earlier. Like I don't have familial connection to Barbados, but I was born in Barbados and left when I was 5. My mother is from St. Lucia and Trinidad, and so also, and I spent a lot of time with my mother. And my parents are together, but I just spent a lot of time with her. And so also there was this very much, like people would call my house, and she would answer the phone and they'd be like, "But who is this lady?" Like like they didn't, like people who didn't know, because they're like, obviously this lady is not Jamaican, And Jamaican people are very quick to, like, I think something that's very interesting in Jamaica that we would like to hold is like Jamaican people struggle with difference, and there's a lot of tension around, and it could be difference in a lot of different ways. And I think, Zinzi and I were talking earlier about like the particular kinds of violences that brought modern Jamaica into being, and I think we're holding that in our bodies and our minds, and I think a lot of that also has to do with the ways in which we project aggression around questions of difference. And so I think, so like, which is just to say that like, when people hear my mother speaking, they'll be like, well, you're not from Jamaica. It was so quick, everybody was quick to say something, which is fine, she's not. But I think she's not from Jamaica, like she's from another island, even though she's lived there now 20-something years. But I think similarly when I came to the US, like I don't feel like I emigrated. Like, I came here to go to school, and I'm still, like I just finished school. It's been a lot of school. And now I'm still trying to figure out what my relationship is to this place. But I do think that there's the question of like, do we need to tie it back to origin, because it's like we get into questions of erasure of indigenous people in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, and also Jamaica is predominantly black because of it, because enslaved black people were brought to Jamaica. You know what I mean? So it's like, what is origin? And like, and it's like, and it's funny, like my great grandmother on my mother's side is from India, and I've never in my life really said like, oh, I'm mixed race. Like I never, like, you know what I mean? And it's only when somebody has pushed me, I've been like, well, look, this is like, and then I will say it, but I still don't feel this like, because I'm like, well, you know what I mean? And even if you look at my mother, it's like, well, clearly like, she's, mixed, like this. And I think, I think it's also like holding the difficulties and holding the complexities and having to also deal with it on a personal level and say, it's okay. Yeah. Like this performance of, I think that the flip side of this, Jamaica has a particular place in like global imaginary, is that there's an idea of what a Jamaican, like you said, Sean, like what a Jamaican is, how they act, how they speak, how they da. And I think I had to at some point let that go for my own self, to be like, if I'm okay with this, however I'm showing up in the world, and that's okay. And also like, origins are fraught. Like I don't think, like I don't want to, because I think Jamaica also is a nationalist country, and I think I don't want to also reproduce that and uphold that. Right. So I think I think Jamaica is a starting point. a place of convergence for a lot of us. You know, in some ways, a convergence, like how we are in this space, thinking about our relationships to this place, but also it's not it's not without complexity, and it's not without like struggles and opposition and all of these different kinds of things.
Why don't we have Zachary or Shoshana answer the question, and then that'll close us out? Okay, perfect.
All right.
Or both. I mean, both of you, two of you.
I was just
Coles.
thinking the idea of like double consciousness and the idea that like when I go home to Jamaica, I'm not Jamaican enough, you know. And then when I'm in America, I'm exoticized, which I don't understand. And then I'm Shoshana Weinberger, although both religions informed me I'm not I don't practice, but on paper, you know, it's like, oh, you know, where's your bat mitzvah? I'm like, I never just attended. I probably should have. No, but that idea of constantly, you know, sort of where do I fit, and then also being able to move in different spaces, you know, like Nella Larson, like thinking about myself as a nomad, shape-shifting, and there's something like strangely magical about that, if that makes any sense. But then there's also something like that I'm very proud to be where my mom's from, and that to me is, I think, and there's still so many questions about where her people are from, and those answers and those things will never be. And I think that's the continuing question and interest in where I am from.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you said.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you all for participating.